Justin Trudeau needs to manage Canada's borders. We have watched for over a year and a half tens of thousands of people illegally cross the border from the United States into Canada, and they have done nothing except throw hundreds of millions of dollars at the problem, which has only made it worse. We're expecting over 400 people per day this summer to enter into Canada. I tabled a motion in the House of Commons today, full support with the Conservative Party of Canada and our leader Andrew Scheer, to get Justin Trudeau to come up with a plan to manage the borders. In fact, we even put forward some suggestions on how to do that. I want you to watch my speech. It's a little bit longer, but it outlines the problem, it outlines what they can do to fix it, and certainly it calls upon the government to act. Watch this.
Ms. Rempel, seconded by Mr. Paulus, moves that, given the government's failure to address the crisis created by the influx of thousands of illegal border crossers traveling across our southern border between ports of entry, that the agencies responsible for dealing with this crisis have found gaps in security screening for newly arrived refugee claimants, as well as a backlog in both scheduled hearings and carrying out deportation orders, and that this trend is expected to increase over the summer months. The House call on the government to A, ensure the agencies responsible for our borders are properly equipped so that they can continue to do their jobs effectively, and that those arriving at Canadian borders go through the appropriate processes. B, admit the Prime Minister's irresponsibility of tweeting #welcome to Canada to those seeking to enter Canada through illegal means. C, take responsibility for the massive social services costs burdening the provincial governments. And D, table in the House no later than May 11, 2018, a plan to, 1, stop the influx of people illegally entering Canada from the United States, 2, take appropriate measures to handle those who have already claimed asylum. Debate. The honourable member for Calgary, Nose Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I want to lay out what exactly this problem is, why this is a problem, how the Liberals got Canada into this situation, the failure of the Liberals to manage the problem, and potential fixes that the Liberals could undertake to stop the flow, but have elected not to do so. So what is the problem, Mr. Speaker? First of all, we have seen a massive, and by massive I mean tens of thousands of person influx of people illegally crossing the border from the United States into Canada and then claiming asylum in the last year. This is, of course, precipitated because Canada has an agreement with the United States called the Safe Third Country Agreement, which I am going to speak to later in my speech. What this agreement says is essentially that if somebody claims asylum in one of our countries, that if they try to enter our country, they should be not making an asylum claim in the other country, because we respect the fact that our asylum claim systems are mutually generous, they're run free of political interference, and they're regarded as some of the strongest in the world. The problem is, Mr. Speaker, is that agreement is silent on what happens when somebody illegally enters the country. So because the agreement is silent on that, this loophole allows people to illegally enter the country and claim asylum. And of course, when somebody claims asylum in Canada, they are automatically entitled to all of the generous social benefits that Canada has, including our healthcare system, social programs and welfare, and many other things that are designed as a social safety net in Canada, but of course are also extended to those that we are bringing in as humanitarian immigrants. But the point being that what is happening, this massive influx, is not planned and it's not orderly. Therefore, the government has been scrambling to throw hundreds of millions of dollars at this, rather than looking at a way to solve the issue and once again bring Canada's immigration system back to order. Just briefly, the statistics. So last year there were 20,593 persons that illegally entered Canada and claimed asylum. This year, these months alone in 2018, and this includes the winter months, there are 6,373, and government documents have shown that they project to have over 400 persons a day this summer. So certainly, based on those projections, we could be anywhere between the 50 to 70,000 persons range. This amount of people, we now have more people illegally entering the country and claiming asylum than those legally entering the country and claiming asylum. There is no plan to deal with this. Very briefly, why this is a problem. Canadians are compassionate, but they want a planned and orderly immigration system. These numbers are not accounted for in the government's immigration levels plan. They're not. So what this means is because the government hasn't accounted or planned for this, they are unable to budget, provincial governments are unable to budget for the impact on social services. The government is unable to understand the cohort who is coming through illegally and claiming asylum and adequately budget for integration services. They don't understand the impact that this might have on the Canadian economy one way or the other. They don't understand because they don't understand the cohort. They don't understand how people might or might not be able to contribute to the Canadian economy. This makes integration support much more difficult, and certainly we're seeing provincial governments say, look, this is impacting us. In fact, the government of Quebec went on a major push over the last couple of months saying, you owe us, federal government, because of your inability to manage the borders. And certainly the federal government did capitulate and had to spend hundreds of millions of dollars more of Canadian tax dollars to give a transfer to Quebec to manage the flow rather than trying to stop the problem. It also renders us less able to help the world's most vulnerable. There is an immigration plan for a reason. The government should stipulate how many people we allow to enter the country through humanitarian means so that we can do all those things that I just talked about, plan for integration. We certainly see that because the government has had to redirect resources to processing illegal migrants, that we see massive wait times in other streams. The private sponsorship refugee stream has over 45,000 case backlog. We all, across party lines, have cases where people are waiting. I've seen cases of people who are trying to get privately sponsored people in from Eritrea. There's an 89-month wait now for that. So think about that. A privately sponsored refugee from Eritrea has to wait over 7 years. Don't you think that that kind of defeats the purpose of a refugee program? Furthermore, the Immigration Refugee Board, government documents, and again, because the government likes to refute that this is the case, Globe and Mail article published last year, so this was June 2017, showed a government report that said that based on the current track that we have for the increase year over year for the number of illegal migrants, that the IRB is on track for an 11-year wait time for processing asylum claims. So if my colleague could shut off his phone, that would be lovely. It's quite distracting. Thank you. The 11-year wait time means that people who are making asylum claims after they've illegally entered the country can then stay in Canada, claim social assistance benefits, they have expedited work permits, they can do all of these things which are unplanned and unbudgeted while we don't even know if their claim is valid. And to me, that's not fair. And many people who are trying to legally enter the country think it's not fair. Because of the demand and the burden that the Liberals' failure to manage our border has placed on the Immigration Refugee Board, there's also been cases. I have the head of the Catholic Immigration Society. He's quoted in a Calgary Herald article a few months ago talking about how it's actually unfair to people who have come into the country, legally made asylum claims, and then they're forced to wait for years to understand whether or not they can stay in Canada. So, you know, well, he didn't say this to me. That could also create disincentive to work, to put down roots, to get to establish any sort of commitment to integration over time, because you don't know if you're going to be able to stay here, Mr. Speaker. And to me, that is absolutely ridiculous. So there's a burden on the system, on the IRB. My colleague, who is our Shadow Minister for Public Safety, the member from Charlebourg-Haute-Saint-Jean, is going to talk later today about the impact that this massive influx of illegal migrants coming into the country has had on screening and border security. He has statistics that he's going to speak to today about how the CBSA has said that I believe it's 400%. They've actually reduced the amount of time that they spend screening people entering the country by 400%. I don't think any Canadian would be satisfied with the fact that the government is accommodating people illegally entering the country by reducing the amount of time that our border agents spend on screening them for security. Certainly this is a burden on the system. We've heard the CBSA, this is the Canadian Border Services Agency, talk about how it's placed a great strain on their resources, that they don't feel that they have enough. But again, the government's response has been, let's throw hundreds of millions of dollars at the problem, but all that has done is make things worse and make our border services, the IRB, less effective because of the demand that's being put on the system. You see, Mr. Speaker, a Liberal response to a crisis like this is throw money at the problem, not look at ways to stop the problem. And in fact, what I think the government has done here by doing things like creating a refugee camp at the U.S.-Canada border, they actually paid for heated tent trailers, has actually incented more people to come into the country through this mechanism, and that is very irresponsible. Also, I am concerned about the fact that the government has basically said, come hither through this mechanism, that might incent people in terms of human smuggling and crime. We've certainly seen cases in the media. Child pornography ring was busted up. We need to put more control on this situation. As well, my colleague is going to talk about the fact that while we've seen a great increase in people illegally entering the country, we've also seen removal orders steadily increase, but the ability of the government to actually execute those removal orders have diminished. So what I'm trying to say is that when people have been found to have no reason to be in the country and a removal order has been issued for them, that the government actually lacks the capacity to remove them. So you can come into the country illegally, you can make an asylum claim and claim social benefits for a long period of time without having your claim heard, and then after that time passes and after you've claimed all of these benefits, even if you're found to not have a legal reason to be in the country, you will have to wait a long period of time to be removed. That is unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. Placing more demand on the system this way is unacceptable. And frankly, it's not fair. Canada is a country where everyone in this place will proudly say we support immigration. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of how. We want to be compassionate. But because the government has turned a blind eye to this, and people who have legally come to this country, other Canadian taxpayers are sitting here looking, going, you know, the Prime Minister stood in Edmonton, you know, only a few short months ago and looked at a Canadian veteran and said, you are asking for more than we can give. Then we have the immigration minister stand up in the House of Commons and talk about the hundreds of millions of dollars that they've proudly thrown at people illegally entering the country. That is not fair. And what I worry about is someone who supports compassionate migration, who supports planned, orderly migration, who sees migration as a key to sustaining the Canadian economy over time when done properly, legally, orderly and safely, that by abdicating the responsibility to do this, it's actually the Liberal Party that is creating divisiveness in the country, because people are starting to talk about if, then how. And people start talking about if when the government abdicates its responsibility to get the how right, which is why we've put this motion forward today to, again, think about this, Mr. Speaker. This has been going on for over 18 months. We're going into another summer. There is report after report after report that has been issued by government officials saying there's a problem, it's happening, here it is. And all the government has done is the following: throw hundreds of millions of dollars at the problem. It's gotten worse. You know, the analogy I used in the House yesterday is that's like having a big hole in your roof during a rainstorm, and your plan is to replace the hardwoods every day. Doesn't make sense to me. But also, you know, the fact that they've actually done nothing to structurally close the problem is irresponsible, and it's taking away that social license. And I really think that that is irresponsible, not just from the expenditure of money and the prioritization of tax dollars, but also in terms of sustaining Canada's hope in immigration over time. So why do they need to table this plan? They knew that this was happening. We're projecting 400 persons a day starting now. They need to table a plan that doesn't say we're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars. We're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars. They need to table a plan that does one of two things, or both. Close the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement that I mentioned earlier, or designate the entire Canadian border as a technical official point of entry in order to stop the flow of people illegally entering the country to claim asylum. So I want to spend the last few minutes of my speech talking about the Safe Third Country Agreement and some of the things that the Liberals should be including. I hope they support this motion today when they table their plan as this motion requests by May 11th. I should note as well, Mr. Speaker, that I did try to raise this issue in the Citizenship and Immigration Committee last week. I did ask committee members to study this at the Citizenship and Immigration Committee in terms of developing a plan. The committee members did vote that down, which I think is very irresponsible, and I encourage anyone watching today to write or phone the members of the Immigration Committee that voted against that particular motion. So I want to talk about the Safe Third Country Agreement very briefly. I gave an outline of what it was, but I want to read an excerpt from an article called The Meaning of Borders, Lessons from the Last World War. It was written by a man named Howard Anglin. It was published on March 12, 2017 in iPolitics. So briefly, one of the most contentious debates during the drafting of the 1951 Convention, this is on refugees, was between the United Kingdom and France over the scope of what would become Article 31, the provision that deals with the circumvention of national borders. Recognizing that a refugee who departs from his country of origin is usually a flight, is rarely in a position to comply with the requirements for legal entry into the country of refuge. Article 31 exempts persons who enters a country seeking refuge in violation of that country's law from normal consequences of their illegal entry and presence. Worried about the large numbers of refugees in the countries bordering France, the French delegate in the drafting convention sought assurances that if those refugees crossed the border from a country where their lives were not in danger, France would be able to return them to the frontier. According to one account of the deliberations, the French delegate observed that to admit a refugee who had settled temporarily in a reception country was free to enter another would be to grant him a right of immigration which might be exercised for reasons of a more personal convenience, which frankly is what I see happening in the situation that we're seeing at the Lacoule border right now, because we certainly know with even the few cases that have been processed by the IRB, and they're very few, Mr. Speaker, that certainly not a majority of them are being found to be valid. So this argument did prevail in the drafting of Article 31. So there is an argument saying that we have international obligations. In fact, legally, the Safe Third Country Agreement is based on this exact provision that I just mentioned. So I'm going to quote some Liberals, Mr. Speaker. So after the Safe Third Country Agreement was negotiated, to preempt American talk of increasing security at the U.S.-Canada border, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien dispatched then Deputy Prime Minister John Manley to Washington to ensure that the legal flow of goods and people between the two countries was not interrupted in the resulting agreement, the Safe Third Country Agreement. Then Immigration Minister Denis Coderre signed an agreement, and he predicted personally that it would allow Canada to turn back 15,000 people a year to the United States. John Manley, at the time, Deputy Prime Minister, explained that it's not a matter of shopping for the country that you want, it's a matter of escaping the oppression that you face. So to build on this quote, I think anybody here would be hard-pressed to say that people are freeing oppression from the United States of America. In fact, I would be fairly offended if somebody said that, and I think our Foreign Affairs Minister would have a great deal of difficulty trying to explain that statement in her negotiations with NAFTA. So certainly if that's the spirit of the Safe Third Country Agreement, and certainly I know the Immigration Minister and the Prime Minister have said that they support the application of the Safe Third Country Agreement, the question must be begged, why they haven't, A, broached with the Americans to close the loophole that I mentioned earlier. I've asked the Immigration Minister this many times in committee. He says they simply haven't raised this with the Americans. So is it a lack of character, a lack of conviction, fright, something else? I don't know, Mr. Speaker. But the fact that they haven't raised this with the Americans begs why they would support the application of the agreement in the first place. You can't suck and blow, Mr. Speaker. You can't say that you support the application of the Safe Third Country Agreement and then say we're going to do nothing to close the loophole and let thousands of people enter the country. My former colleague, Jason Kenney, did try to do this. He is on the record saying that he feels that the Americans under the previous administration saw this as a way for people to self-deport into Canada. So what can we do here in Canada? What we could do in terms of having this, I'll read very quickly. the immigration refugee protection regulations define ports of entry as A, a place set out in Schedule 1, and B, a place designated by the Minister under Section 26 as a port of entry. Schedule 1 identifies more than 70 land ports. Section 26 refers to the authority to designate points of entry by the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. And the Minister may, on the basis of the following factors, designate a place as a port of entry as well as the port of entry's dates and hours of operation. And it lists a series of criteria. There is no reason, there might be some legal requirements around putting infrastructure in place. That could easily be changed so that the entire Canadian land border could be defined as for a technical application for the Safe Third Country Agreement so that it would apply. Then we don't need to set up tent trailers. Then we don't need to add hundreds of millions of dollars to the RCMP and CBSA for the purpose of solely managing illegal immigrants. The spirit of the agreement would apply, and frankly, as we see needs in legislation, that's what we do here. We should be seeking to solve problems. If we are going to see this agreement apply, then we should be looking to a solution like that. I would love to say we would do that if we were in government. However, it is the government's responsibility to table a plan, and that is what the spirit of this motion is today. I want to close by saying again how we got here. You'll remember that when the Americans issued an executive order around immigration, the Prime Minister tweeted, #Welcome to Canada. And Mr. Speaker, of course, we saw an article in the National Post dated April the 3rd, 2018, where it outlines the confusion that was obtained through access to information, the confusion of embassies, citizenship and immigration, because all of a sudden they were inundated with requests for people saying, well, I can just come in, right? And this is when we started seeing the spike in people illegally entering the country. So certainly, Mr. Speaker, we know that this tweet, the Prime Minister has never taken responsibility for it, and certainly he's done nothing to rectify the problem that it caused. So it is incumbent upon him before the summer, before we have another 45 to 55,000 people enter the country illegally, that creates all of these issues, to solve it. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask my colleagues to support this motion, and I call upon the government to table a concrete plan that doesn't just replace the hardwood, but actually solves the issue that we have and get back to the principle of compassionate, planned, orderly migration. Thank you.
Questions and comments. L'honorable député d'Acadie-Bathurst.
On voit encore aujourd'hui la stratégie des conservateurs, encore un climat de peur qui s'installe, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, j'ai pris quelques notes dans le discours de la députée de Calgary-Rempel. Et laissez-moi commencer par ceci, Monsieur le Président. Les Canadiens, je veux les rassurer, toutes les personnes qui franchissent irrégulièrement la frontière sont vérifiées au niveau de leur identité, de leur sécurité, de leur identité, pardonnez-moi, et leur antécédent criminel, Monsieur le Président. Si on ne peut pas prouver que ces personnes-là, elles sont renvoyées, Monsieur le Président, mais quand ce qu'ils disent aussi que le système d'immigration est brisé, Monsieur le Président, on a hérité du gouvernement précédent d'un système d'immigration brisé, Monsieur le Président. Nous avons remis ce système d'immigration sur la bonne voie. Et Monsieur le Président, dans son discours, il dit ceci, que nous avons garoché de l'argent par la fenêtre, Monsieur le Président. C'est faux, Monsieur le Président. Nous avons investi, Monsieur le Président, 174 millions dans 74 millions pour processer les demandes d'asile le plus rapidement possible. Monsieur le Président, l'ancien gouvernement avait coupé plus de 400 millions de dollars au niveau du budget de l'immigration. Alors, ma question est la suivante, parce que la députée de Calgary-Rempel le dit à plusieurs reprises qu'elle nous a demandé d'investir de plus dans le budget 2018, ce que nous avons fait, Monsieur le Président, 174 millions. Alors, question très simple. Oui ou non, plus d'argent pour la Commission statut des réfugiés pour processer les demandes le plus rapidement? Oui ou non, Monsieur le Président?
The honourable member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
So, Mr. Speaker, for those who might be listening to the floor feed and couldn't understand my colleague, what my colleague started off his speech by saying was that I was fear-mongering. So you have a Liberal Prime Minister who stood in Halifax last weekend and talked about divisive politics, yet the number one thing that the Liberals put when any person in this place says we would like to have a planned, orderly, compassionate immigration system, we encourage immigration, it should be done orderly, fair and safely, they say that we're fear-mongering. Now think about how irresponsible that is. Think about bringing up the concept of fear-mongering, and I'm not going to go into what that means, but anybody listening knows what that means, as opposed to coming up with a plan. And that's such a liberal leftist tactic, is rather than deal with the problem, They go fear-mongering. So I think Canadians are rejecting that en masse. Canadians are rejecting that sort of divisive politics. My colleague also, once again, tried to, talk about, he defended this by saying we're spending, what, $1 billion, $2 billion? I don't know. I would just push back and say, look at your metrics, Mr. Speaker. What is it, 100% increase over the last 3 months last year, tens of thousands more people coming in. The problem is not being solved. And Mr. Speaker, Canadians who understand that tax dollars have a prioritization don't think that this is the best expenditure of money. Thank you.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for her comments. Let me first say this very clearly. I absolutely agree that there needs to be a study on this issue so that we can work on a plan, that the Conservative claims that they want it to be compassionate and orderly. Yet at this motion, with this motion, they insist on misrepresenting the situation using words like illegal. Now, the member sits on the Committee for Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship, and she knows the file. And so from that perspective, she ought to know that in the Immigration Refugee Protection Act, sections 117 and 133 specifically indicates that a person could cross to Canada irregularly, and that by crossing over irregularly, that they are not, and I emphasize the word not, committing a crime, that they're not committing the crime under the criminal code. Given that that is the fact of the case, given that Canada accepts people who come over irregularly within the Immigration Refugee Protection Act, why would the member and the Conservatives insist on fear-mongering with the term illegal?
Honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Well, so if you come to the United States border, you will see a large sign that says, do not cross, you will be arrested. And then when people do that, including people that are entering the country to claim asylum, what happens to them? They are arrested. So therefore, it is illegal. So we're sitting here arguing semantics over the fact that people are illegally entering our country instead of coming up with a plan to encourage orderly, planned migration. And why does the NDP want to do this? Because they, with the Liberals, don't want to see a plan in place where we encourage people to enter the country through planned, orderly migration. That is the fact here. And you know what? News outlets have used this term. I'm not going to sit here and argue semantics. What I'm asking for is action, Mr. Speaker. Action on the fact.
Order. I'm not far from the member who's speaking, but I'm having a hard time hearing her with all the shouting. I'll let the member proceed, please.
Here, Mr. Speaker. It's because, for some reason, the Liberals will not table a plan to stop this problem. If the policy of the Liberal government is now to encourage people to illegally enter the country and claim asylum, then just say that. People will hold them to account in the next election. That is not the immigration system that I envision for our country. I want to ensure that the world's most vulnerable have priority access into our country and that we have planned, orderly migration that meets the needs of the Canadian economy, not billions of dollars of unaccounted federal money that we don't have that makes the problem worse.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for, I'm sorry, I was going to go somewhere, but Peace River Westlock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my honourable colleague for her amazing speech. I know that she worked long and hard on that one. Mr. Speaker, in my riding, and particularly my hometown, there is a church community that has been waiting for 4 years for a Syrian refugee family for which they've been trying to settle them. I know that each time the backlog gets longer and longer, groups like the church community in my community that have been waiting for the Syrian refugee are continually told that it's going to be a longer and longer wait. I was wondering if my colleague has any comments about that.
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Mr. Speaker, I think we should celebrate as a country the fact that we have so many families, so many groups across this country that privately raise money to sponsor people to this country, to start new lives, to contribute to the Canadian economy, that are fleeing areas of persecution. That is something that we should be promoting, we should be encouraging more of, and we should be supporting more robustly. Think about the hundreds of millions of dollars that the government is spending to accommodate illegal migrants into this country. If that could go into, ESL programs in small communities, or processing of privately sponsored refugees. I know, Mr. Speaker, there are 45,000 cases where people have raised money to bring people into the country legally, and what the government has been doing is redirecting processing resources from those streams to Montreal to process illegal border crossers. What kind of message does that send to people who are trying to support this wonderful process that we have in our country? What kind of a message does it send to somebody who's trying to reunify with one of their family members? Mr. Speaker, the priorities here of this government are backwards. We're arguing semantics. We are arguing about spending hundreds of millions of dollars when there are technical, very easy legal fixes that could restore order to our immigration system, and yet the government just doesn't even want to talk about them. They don't even acknowledge that they exist. And to me, Mr. Speaker, that is divisive. That is what is going to cause loss of social license in this country for immigration. That is what is really irresponsible. They should table a plan. It should be concrete. It should have legal actions to stop the flow, not just accommodate people coming here. And that's what our focus should be. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, that is what a Conservative government did and would do in the future.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Parkdale High Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Three brief comments. First of all, in response, in terms of the context of a robust debate, in response to the member for Peace River Westlock, it is precisely because of people like his constituents who are trying to privately sponsor Syrian refugees that we have quadrupled the amount of private sponsorship that is available in this country as compared to the number that was put forward by the previous government under their tenure at the head of this file. Second point, I actually find it quite astounding that the member who raised this motion, the member from Calgary-Nose Hill, has raised Minister Jason Kenney as some sort of paragon of proper stewardship or administration of the immigration portfolio. A man under whose watch health care for refugees was cut, a man under whose watch refugee selection from the Middle East during the height of the Syrian refugee crisis was done on selective minority religious grounds only, and a man under whose watch processing times ballooned to the point where waiting times were 2 to 3 years. But my question is specifically for the member for Calgary-Nose Hill is with respect to the myth that her and her party continue to propagate in this House and outside of this House, which is that somehow inland asylum seekers are queue jumping. Mr. Speaker, clearly there is a humanitarian category, and there are separate categories for people who come here for permanent resident status under family reunification or economic migration. The two categories are distinct and disparate. After 2.5 years as the opposition critic, I would have thought the member for Calgary-Nose Hill would have an understanding of that specific differentiation.
Member for Calgary-Nose Hill in 45 seconds or less, please.
I think that the Liberal Party is in for a big wake-up call, because everything that the member just said, people are going to be aghast at. Very quickly on health care, I think many Canadians would say that those who legally enter the country should have priority access to our generous social programs, and that we actually have to talk about the sustainability of our social programs in terms of our immigration system through the concept of planned orderly migration. With regard to the selection of refugees, it took me over a year to convince this government to bring in Yazidi genocide survivors through their Syrian refugee initiative, and it was that member opposite that sat in a committee meeting with me and disgustingly for an entire summer tried to argue why they shouldn't come here. That's the principles of the Liberal government. We will always stand proudly and support planned orderly migration as opposed to the disaster that this government has shamefully turned our immigration system.
Resuming.
Seems like a common sense thing to me. You saw from the comments on the Liberals and the NDP that they just don't get this issue. I'm sitting here in the House of Commons today. I'm going to go back into debate, but certainly, if you can, phone a Liberal MP, ask them to support this motion. You can see that the Conservatives are working hard for you on this issue. We want fair, compassionate, orderly migration that's planned. We certainly don't want unplanned migration that erodes support for immigration writ large in Canada. Working hard for you in Ottawa in a very loud House of Commons lobby. Have a great day.